Okay, and now I will do share screen. Show in the beginning. So you all can see that, right? Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. I just want to say I am not an expert in Aboriginal art, but I taught for 15 years. I taught art history at the Australian National University in Canberra, during which time I did teach Australian art, and my husband worked at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. So we were very involved at the time with Aboriginal issues, and this was a very eventful time. And this was the period in which native title claims were really beginning, and Aborigines would come into the Institute to give their oral history so that they could provide evidence that they had lived in that particular place for a long time. And it was also the time when Aboriginal art became, as the late great Australian critic Robert Hughes has called it, the last great modern art movement. And I'm just putting this picture up as some contemporary Aborigines painted for one of their ceremonies. So we're going to be talking about the development of contemporary Aboriginal art, the movement, and this is going to raise some intriguing questions when confronting, when these kinds of images and when Aborigines producing these images confront a modern Western society. First of all, is this question of, is it art or is it ethnography? Also, the very vexed issue of the art market's implications for tribal indigenous people. And finally, one that I find really fascinating is the question of what are we to make of our Western aesthetic response as non-Indigenous people to images that for the maker have very different meanings. So first I want to start with a map of Australia to point out where, just broadly, we're going to be talking about. First of all, you see all the cities and all the most of the population of Australia is along the coast. Even over here in Perth, and there's Adelaide. Darwin is up here. And this is Cape York, which is an Aboriginal reserve, and Arnhem Land is up above Catherine, and that is an Aboriginal preserve as well. Most of the art we're going to be talking about comes from here, which is true back of beyond. This is totally desert. Alice Springs is what most people talk about when they go to the outback. But Uluru, the famous rock, Ayers Rock, is actually 400 miles away from Alice Springs. So that gives you a kind of an idea of how expansive, how enormous this place is. We also talk often about the Torres Strait Islanders, and this is the area that we mean, right up here above Cape York. This is Papua New Guinea. So these islands are also inhabited by different Aboriginal groups. And all of these areas, all of these groups have a different language. There are some 350 established languages, out of which there are hundreds of dialects as well. There are places up in the Torres Strait Islanders, for example, with one of the islands, there are 50 people who speak one language, and on the other side of the island is another group that speaks an entirely different language. So not even related like we are to Indo-European, for example. And here is Arrente is one of the bigger groups, and they're the ones who are the custodians for Uluru, for the rock itself. And there's Alice Springs. We'll also be talking about Papunya and Yuendumu, who are these areas where some of the very first of Aboriginal art made on canvas with acrylic painting come from. And this is just to show you how elaborate the language systems are. Many of them have died out, but these are ones that are still identifiable. And there are still some native speakers for most of these languages. Aborigines have been in Australia for at least 40,000, probably 60,000 years. They are the descendants of the first people to leave Africa up to 75,000 years ago. That has been determined by a genetic study, confirming that they may have the oldest continuous culture on the planet. They have usually consisted of small nomadic groups, and as I've said, each one with their own language. At the start of the 21st century, there are fewer than 150 indigenous languages remaining in daily use, and all except roughly 20 are highly endangered. Aborigines had no established settlements, very little material culture. They did have implements and bark paintings and some artifacts, but they then were always established in the colonial kind of discussion as hard primitivism, as opposed to the soft primitivism we talked about before of the Polynesians. The contemporary movement toward Aboriginal Aboriginal rights and concomitantly the development of this interaction of Aboriginal artworks with the Western world, with Anglo settlement, really begins with the land rights issues that started in the 1960s. And this is a famous picture of Vincent Lingiari, who led a group of stockmen. The stockmen who worked the huge ranches, the huge land properties in the outback, were only paid in lodgings and food. They received no, and it was actually law that you weren't supposed to pay Aborigines. And Vincent Lingiari started a strike with others of his tribe, that they would not work until, first of all, they were given equal pay, and that they would also be able to get their land back. And remember that when Australia was established by white settlers, it was declared to be terra nullius, that is, a land belonging to no one. And that was a very convenient way for a white settlement to happen, because they said, well, nobody owned this land, so we can all settle. And of course, the Aborigines, who were totally tied to their idea of their land, were completely ignored in this kind of idea. So it was with Vincent Lingiari that this movement begins. And we have here a picture, a very famous picture of the first really progressive prime minister, Gough Whitlam, who Lingiari brought this case to the High Court, and terra nullius was overturned. And here in this very symbolic moment, Gough Whitlam is pouring sand from Vincent Lingiari's land into his hands. He said at the time, Vincent said, "My name, Vincent Lingiari, come from Daguragu, Wattle Creek Station. I have come here to tell the Parliament about land rights. I got stories from my old grandpa that the land belonged to me, Aboriginal man, before all the horses and cattle came onto the land. I've got that story on my mind." And as we'll see, all of the art we're talking about has to do with stories, and land. So this was a very historic moment. The other figure in this was a Torres Strait Islander, Eddie Mabo. And this is a picture of him against the Torres Strait Islander flag. And he also campaigned for Indigenous land rights at about the same time. And it was under his name that a landmark decision by the High Court of Australia overturned that legal doctrine of terra nullius. So this was the atmosphere in which we begin to see what we consider Aboriginal art today was developing. So it's against that environment that contemporary Aboriginal art develops. So I want to just look at a few of the paintings now to give you an idea of how diverse it's becoming and how very much it's still tied to this idea of the stories about their land. This is the winner of the Telstra National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Awards in 2020. He is an outback Aborigine, part of his tribe, part of his indigenous group. And his paintings, including this one, which won the top prize, consistently refer to his place, to Yalpirakinu, which means essentially his homeland. He was living at Yuendumu. Another of the winners of these awards were the women of this collaborative in a place called Chala, which is way out, very, very isolated. And this is an example of how the artists often work together as a collaborative. And this is the painting, again, of their land, Nanganapa Ngura. And these are the women of this tribal settlement. And they won this. And their name is actually, of the title of their painting is Our Place. And I wanted to put up finally one more recent winner, and this is of the 2022 awards by D. Yunupingu. And this is of her granddaughters. And I wanted to just include this little story because it gives an idea of how they're using their art to talk about place. And she says, these are my granddaughters swimming around the rock Yunupingu, so the rock itself has a name, just like I used to do. This is our family rock, our foundation. Mermaids are special to me because this is how my unborn spirit announced itself to my father. So you can see that by this time, what we consider traditional Aboriginal art is changing. So the artists are adopting, even when they're not urban Aborigines. We'll talk about that as well. Okay, Aborigines have, of course, been making art that is creating images since ancient times. Rock art has been discovered all over, especially the northern part in the Kimberleys and in Kakadu, which is up near Darwin. And these have been dated as early as 40,000 years ago. There's some debate about whether they're even earlier. And what we see here are the figures of the Wangina. And these Wangina are still cared for. They're one of the most prominent creation myths. And I'll just read a little passage from this my husband wrote we did a cultural tour guide of Australia. And this kind of summarizes, and maybe you can get a handle on how complicated this relationship to their images can be. The regional Aboriginal rock paintings center around Wangina spirits involved in the creation myths. These wondrous fertility guardians bring the monsoons and cyclones to ensure regeneration of life. They are in human form with hair that is also the area's large white cumulonimbus clouds. They can cause lightning to emanate from their feathered headdresses. The Wangina live the dry months of the year in their self-portrait rock paintings. During the wet, the local Aboriginal people preserve them by retouching the paintings while the Wangina are away tending to the rains. So these are living things to them. They're not just depictions symbolically. They touch them up while the Wangina are actually away to make them happy when they return. This is the figure of the Wangina, the motif, the symbol of it, that if any of you saw the 2000 Sydney Olympics, this was created at the opening ceremony. And indeed, they would have gotten permission from the custodians, the owners of the rock paintings, to use this image, that it was all right for other people, uninitiated people, to see. The other great site for rock painting is in Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory. And it provides these provide an interesting insight into the process in which the convention of artistic styles develop. So prior to the end of the last ice age, rock art in Kakadu presented human and animal figures in animated poses. And so we see turtles and we see kangaroos, and we're beginning to see what later on will be translated and transferred as a style into bark painting and later into canvas paintings. The other motif, the other figure that appears specifically in Kakadu rock art are the mimis. The mimi are tall, thin beings that live in the rocky escarpment of Northern Australia as spirits. Before the coming of Aboriginal people, they had human forms. The mimis are generally harmless, but on occasions can be mischievous. And this one, which is a very powerful Mimi spirit, again in Kakadu, and I'm going to read what one person has written about them. Mimis are so shy that they hide within huge boulders all day long and only come out at night by blowing holes in the rocks and emerging with their weapons and pets. Their pets are echidnas, crocodiles, kangaroos, goannas, bandicoots, rock wallabies, butterflies, and on and on. They are generally calm in nature and only get upset when an intruder kills or injures one of their pets. They are not against any other of these species being killed for food, but they become extremely upset if one of their own pets is harmed. All night long, the mimis hunt and fish and hold ceremonies. Then at dawn, they go back into their homes and pull the rock doors shut after them. Aborigines respect the wishes of Mimi spirits to have complete privacy and are careful to stay away from the escarpments at night. So they're kind of a mischievous but a bit scary figure as well. And you'll see the mimis also translated into more contemporary Aboriginal pieces. These are Mimi spirits collecting bush tucker. So these are motifs, totems in a way, that will be transferred into paintings by Aborigines if they represent either approved imagery for their group, or if it's part of their dreaming. And this is where things get very complicated for Westerners to understand, I think. Now, there were, of course, early bark paintings found by the early Western explorers. These are two works of photograph and a bark painting found by one of the earliest explorers, Baldwin Spencer, in the early 1900s. We now think that much of what Baldwin Spencer was depicting or was taking photographs of should not be shown because it does include imagery that the uninitiated Aborigines should not be seeing. So there are all of these very elaborate laws by Aboriginal groups about what can be seen, what can be depicted, and what cannot be done. So this is an ongoing problem of this confrontation, especially in the early times of the expeditions, the explorers and Aborigines themselves. So they were painting bark paintings early on, usually and almost always for ceremonies or religious initiations. The same with painting of the body for ceremonial practices. These were things that were part of rituals. And here we have Baldwin Spencer looking particularly lugubrious. Unfortunately, he was one of those who believed that the Aborigines would die out, that they were the last traces in 1894. There were other more benign explorers and missionaries who took him to task for that idea. But that's, as we know, is a standard trope on the part of Western colonialists, that indigenous tribes are going to die out. The other imagery, the other creation of imageries was as body painting. This is from a later expedition. And probably by this time, the Aborigines were aware of, what that Western man was going to show. So they would have painted only those things that could be seen by others. And the other form, of course, was sand painting. Sand painting, again, was part of initiation rites. This is from one of the really egregious postcards that were made in the for tourists in the early 1900s, setting this up for like tourists, as if these Aborigines were fighting these other Aborigines. And we see the sand paintings here, which later on we'll see those same kind of motifs translated onto canvas. While the relative permanence of rock art makes it an important means of dating the introduction of motifs and styles, it was not the most frequently used medium. So this painting of bodies was a standard part of it. Most of the motifs found in bark and canvas paintings are secular variations on the motifs in the consciously ephemeral body and sand paintings. Oh yeah, here's another one. Again, set up in the early 1900s, by which time they were never put in reservations, but they were either brought in. The children, of course, were often taken away, of the stories of the lost generations. And they were removed often from their land if it conflicted with where the white men wanted to have settlements, and pushed further north. And we'll talk about the sad implications of that. But the most important and ascetic aspect, I don't mean aesthetic, but ascetic aspect, to understand about Aboriginal art is the concept of the dreaming. The dreaming in Western Australian Aboriginal language is the chukurpa. There are other names for it in other languages, but chukurpa is the one that we've kind of grasped onto as describing, to use when talking about the idea of the dreaming. And this is one of the very early pieces done by an Aborigine on canvas, Moon and Morning Star Chukurpa, and you'll notice the date, it's 1973. And I want to just read what Bruce Chatwin in his book, The Songlines, talks about in trying to describe and define what the dreaming is. When talking to an Aboriginal painter about a particular work, he or she will first of all tell the visitor, as far as the constraints of religious secrecy allow, about the chukurpa, the dreaming, which is the painting's source. He or she will describe the specific interpretation which the symbols assume in this story. The artist will point to the tract of country in which the story takes place, often naming the sites in great detail, and he will talk about the custodianship of the area where the story is centered, naming both specific contemporary custodians and the particular subsection of the kin system through whom ownership is generally passed down. For the artist, this is the essential background information to the proper understanding and appreciation of their work. A painting not informed by a dreaming, if such a thing were seriously possible, would be nothing more than frivolous decoration, simply not art. Oh, I see. Do I have some questions? Please explain the meaning of initiated members. Those are the members of tribes who have gone through initiation rites. There are male initiation rites and there are female initiation rites. And that's when they are taken in by the elders and explained aspects of their dreaming, aspects of their story, which are not allowed to be known by others. So it's part of their cosmology. It's part of their identification with their place. Now, for example, in this, all of these elements, they're not decorative. They stand for a particular place. This is probably a campsite, or a place where they find, it's often these circles are water holes. In this case, there's the sun and the moon as well. And the dots are often, these are clouds. And as we'll see, the dots perform all kinds of different tasks. In some cases, they are to cover up a layer of other knowledge. In some cases, they represent a storm, or they represent a kind of foodstuff. In this case, they may be also representing stars. It's confusing, but they will know this, and that's what's revealed to them in their initiation rites. In another description of from a wonderful article called "Make 'em Flash, Poor Bugger," this is talking about the men's paintings at Papunya. There's another description, or that description I've just read is from Ian Green. It's not from Bruce Chapman. Bruce Chapman referred to the dreaming as the song lines. The Aborigines don't use that term. They may now, but that was his term at the time. And this is from Wally Caruana, who was the curator speaking on that last video that I sent you. And he's the one who made this book, which I do recommend. Oops, you can't see it. Okay. I do recommend if you want a real good overview. This is Wally Caruana's Aboriginal Art. He says, the dreaming is a European term used by Aborigines to describe the spiritual, natural, and moral order of the cosmos. It relates to the period from the genesis of the universe to a time beyond living memory. The terms do not refer to the state of dreams or unreality, but rather to a state of reality beyond the mundane. The dreaming focuses on the activities and epic deeds of the supernatural beings and creator ancestors, such as the rainbow serpent. There we go. The lightning men, the Wagalag sisters, and Wangina, who in both human and non-human form traveled across the unshaped world, creating everything in it and laying down the laws of social and religious behavior. The dreaming provides the ideological framework by which human society remains in harmonious balance with the universe, a charter and mandate that has been sanctified over time. So it's within that framework, this kind of moral law, that we have to consider all of, especially the early paintings, the early examples of Aboriginal art. All the elements and motifs are totemic, and all of Aboriginal cosmology. The belief systems are about the law, the spiritual order that must be tended if the world is to be kept in balance. And there are levels of knowledge, and the proper ways of living are revealed in these initiation rites. So let me go back to this painting. The irregularly dotted shapes represent clouds and a night scene. He describes a love story, and the journeys of sun and moon across the heavens are a part of their everlasting romance. The stars represent the campfires of warriors from the ancient past. So Aboriginal art is first and foremost representational. And in most cases, the paintings tell a story that can have several layers of meaning. Many of its conventions are recognizable to the viewer, and with a bit of assistance, the viewer can recognize the half donut shapes and the bisected angles in dot paintings as campsites and emu tracks. But there are various styles that appear, just like in Western art. One region has a particular style from another region, and one of those is this is in the Kimberleys usually. This is the X-ray style, in which we show the major organs and the skeleton of the animal, or humans as well. This cross-hatching, which appears to us to be just decorative, is actually, it's called RARK, R-A-R-R-K. And these actually represent, they're emblematic of a particular tribal group or family member. So they can be read as a code to who and what group has made this image. I want to focus on these two major styles. The first is that one of the X-ray style, but also including this cross-hatching design and colors, which represent totemic or kin groups associated with stewardship of a particular site. So they're related usually to a particular site of that particular tribe's land. The rainbow serpent that you see here with all of this kind of cross-hatching, as this one also has, is one of the motifs that seems to extend across several Aboriginal groups. And this is another one of the creation myths. Rainbow serpent, and I wanted to put this one up. This is one that we bought in 1998. It belongs to my son now. We bought this at an Aboriginal art show in Canberra. It was painted by a young man who, I've lost his name, alas, who was imprisoned at the time. But he's painting this as a sign of renewal and connection to this kind of creation myth that of the rainbow serpent. It's shared by several tribes. The serpent as a creation of being is perhaps the oldest continuing religious belief in the world, dating back several thousands of years. The rainbow serpent features in the dreaming stories of many mainland Aboriginal nations and is always associated with watercourses such as billabongs, rivers, creeks, and lagoons. The rainbow serpent is the protector of land, its people, and the source of all life. However, it can also be a destructive force if it is not properly respected. The most common version of the rainbow serpent story tells that in the dreaming, the world was flat, bare, and cold. The rainbow serpent slept under the ground with all the animal tribes in her belly waiting to be born. When it was time, she pushed up, calling to the animals to come from their sleep. She threw the land out, making mountains and hills, and spilled water over the land, making rivers and lakes. She made the sun, the fire, and all the colors. So as you see, these are all connected to elaborate stories, which again would only be revealed in increments to those who are initiated. The other movement that I want to concentrate on begins with an extraordinary story and an extraordinary artist at a particular moment in Australian history. And this was on Christmas Eve, 1974. Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin. The city was, this is its destruction. It caused the largest evacuation of human beings up to that time. The Australian Air Force flew in planes and evacuated 33,000 people because there was just nothing left of Darwin, of the town of Darwin at that time. The city of Darwin was regarded by Aboriginal people of the Kimberley as the center of European culture. And as cyclones, rain, and storms are usually associated with ancestral rainbow serpents, elders interpreted the events as the ancestors warning Aboriginal people to reinvigorate their cultural practices. And there was one member of a Kimberley group, the Warmun community. This is Rover Thomas, excuse me. And this is his depiction later of Cyclone Tracy, a black path through a colored landscape. And it's easily recognized once its significance is explained. And I wanted to include here, I'm so proud of myself that I figured out how to do this, if I did. Oh no, did I not do it right? Oh, phooey. I had a very nice little video, which was explaining the story, which was pretty elaborate. Oh, pooey, I can't get it to go. Anyway, Rover Thomas had a personal connection to what happened during Cyclone Tracy. One of his relatives was another elder of the community, and she was in Darwin as the storm began and was ill and was being airlifted out when she died while crossing the river of their country. This was a warning to Rover Thomas. He said he had dreams that this was his elder, this woman was telling him that this was the rainbow serpent, saying that Aborigines of this group had to start paying more attention to their laws. And that was the cause of the cyclone. Now, I just find this painting to be so incredibly moving. And I'm sorry I didn't get that up correctly. I thought I did. And here I am in Canberra, where it is. When I wanted to have this produced I wanted to include it in our cultural tour guide of Australia. But at the time, the painting, all of Rover Thomas's works were still being taken care of by a Western Australian kind of agent. And we had to go through very elaborate payments and also just a regard for the significance of it. I had to be told the story. So I understood how important it was. Now it's in the National Gallery of Australia. And I was hoping that that video would explain it. Now, Rover Thomas continued to paint many of these works with large areas of black, and this is referring to the cyclone, and then the land behind has something to do, again, with the rainbow serpent. I've never quite figured that out. But anyway, at one time, one of my colleagues, Sasha Grishin, who was kind of the writer on Australian art, was able to accompany Rover Thomas, who was by that time very infirm and in a wheelchair, and they took him through the National Gallery of Art, and he stopped at this painting by Mark Rothko, who, of course, Mark Rothko was interested in kind of spiritual ideas in his art and his abstractions. And Rover Thomas stopped here and he said, "White fella paint like me, but he don't know how to use black." Which I thought was a wonderful example of this kind of interaction. Now, to get a better idea of how in the progression of Aboriginal imagery from bark painting to its contemporary interpretations, I wanted to focus on one particular story, not the rainbow serpent, but this is the story of the Wagalag sisters. And this is exemplary of how these paintings work for Aborigines. It's a kind of elaborate story with parts that sound a little bit crazy for us, but mean a lot to Aborigines. So this is the song line. The story goes that the two Wagalag sisters, one of whom was pregnant, you see them there, were fleeing their home and were being followed by clansmen. On their travels, they came across many animals and plants and brought them into life by naming them. Eventually, the Wagalag sisters set up camp beside a fertile water hole. So this is the water hole at Miramina. There, one of the sisters pollutes the water and the pregnant sister gives birth, which causes Wittich, the python, who is a kind of rainbow serpent, and so you see Wittich here, to wake up angry and incensed. Wittich creates a storm on emerging from the water hole and attempts to wash the two Wagalag sisters into the well with his downpour. So that's considered the first monsoon. The two Wagalag sisters dance and sing sacred songs in an attempt to diffuse the situation and keep them safe. But when the sisters become too exhausted to continue, the python is able to swallow them up, including in some of the stories, a child and a dog. So we have children here, but not the dog in this one. However, soon after, Wittich develops stomach pains and groans skywards above the land, where he attracts the attention of other great snakes who also rise up into the sky. The great snakes talk and they discover they all have different names, but they wonder why the python is ill. Realizing he made a mistake, Wittich lies about what he has just eaten, but the pain becomes so unbearable, Wittich falls back to the land and vomits up the sisters, who regain their life from the stinging bites of caterpillars. And you see the caterpillars here. Let's see. Undeterred, Wittich beats them with clapsticks and eats them again. So these are clapsticks down here. Later, the Wagalag sisters' clansmen here, asleep in the hollow left by the python's fall, were visited in their dreams by the sisters, who revealed to the clansmen the secrets of the songs and dances which had been performed in an effort to stop the rainstorm. So this establishes the iconography of this story. Just like Christian iconography, it has these elements which would be immediately recognizable to those who understand that story. Oh, this is about the Wagalag sisters, so that must be this artist's dreaming. This is a more contemporary interpretation of the Wagalag sisters with a child. And here we have one of the first of the bark paintings of the Wagalag story being painted by Yilkari. And here he is painting that very Wagalag story in 1937. So these would have been created as forms in sand painting at initiation rites. And now he's translated it to a bark painting. And you see the footsteps here. You see the people just as little dots. And here's Wittich, the serpent. And this was probably the water hole. And these would have been their clan elements, all of this cross-hatching along the sides. Those would have been read correctly by those who knew that part of the story. Another one of the early Aboriginal artists to be making examples of the Wagalag creation story was Dawidi. He's also called something else, I can't remember, Jawinja, I think. And he did several versions of this. And here's one that's 1960. This is in the National Gallery. So these include those same iconographic elements. The other great stylistic development that most of us recognize as Aboriginal art are the so-called dot paintings of the central desert communities. This is by Clifford Possum Jalpachari, who's Clifford Possum is one of the better known of the early Aboriginal paintings. This is a frog dreaming, and you can see that these are little elements of probably some kind of widgery grubs that have something to do with this frog story, or they could be pollywogs, I'm not sure. But again, these dot paintings have to do with they're either clouds or they could be covering up some other story underneath. These are the very early ones that were done at the settlement of Papunya. Again, we have seen these forms before in the sand paintings. These are probably meant to be campgrounds. And this is perhaps a waterway. I'm not sure, but he would have known and he would have explained that to those who needed to know. Okay, so these are including from the early days, those motifs that were translated from sand paintings. Now, as I said, until recently, these were generally religious and ephemeral, and the work being done on the ground or with body decorations. Public awareness of the forms in the desert depended upon photographs by ethnographers, which were first taken in the early 20th century, or rock art, or more transportable decorations. So there were those Aborigines who had been brought into missions did start to make imagery on wood from the 1940s on, which were for purposes of tourists. But all of these images up until the 1970s and 80s were seen only in ethnography settings, only as ethnographic elements. Now, some early workers with Aborigines had, for example, in the 1940s, Ronald and Catherine Berndt were early explorers who were interested in early ethnographers and anthropologists who were interested in Aboriginal language, had sat down with a group of the Gumachi tribe and gave them crayons and asked them to make some drawings. So these had been transferred in isolated cases from bark painting into other ones. And this is the beginning of the Aboriginal interaction with the Western art market and commercialism. But it's important to remember that Aborigines at this point were still choosing to reveal elements of their cosmology, their spiritual practices, and we're still not quite clear on how they were supposed to do this. So they were very anxious about what could be revealed and what couldn't, because this interaction with all of these Westerners was so different than anything that they experienced in their own tribal groups. The number of anthropological and gallery exhibits predate this by a century or more. There were German and Swiss anthropological collections, such as the Ethnographic Museum in Basel, where there were important early archives of Aboriginal artifacts in Europe. The most important inaugural exhibition in Australia was the 1929 National Museum of Victoria's Primitive Art Show, which included an anthropological display of Baldwin Spencer's collection of bark paintings that he had acquired in 1912. This is a catalog, the catalog of that show, but reprinted as Australian Aboriginal art in 1952. And it did include these kinds of illustrations of bark paintings. But again, in an ethnographic setting. It wasn't until 1959 that an Australian art gallery began to collect Aboriginal art as art rather than ethnographic artifacts. When the Art Gallery of New South Wales, under artist and curator Tony Tuxon, who you see here, began to display works by artists from Tiwi and Arnhem Land cultures, and that's way, way in the north. He commissioned the group of artists on the Melville Islands, those are islands right off the coast of Darwin, to produce these grave posts. And this is the first commission of Aboriginal work by a gallery of modern art. The artists made a conscious choice to produce for an outside audience, but they employed traditional techniques of carving and painting. These were sculptures made from ironwood rather than traditional blackwood, which was reserved for ceremonies. The Pukumani ceremony is unique to Tiwi. It is a final goodbye with singing and dancing accompanying the placement of tutini around the gravesite. They first would bury the deceased, and then after a time when it had turned to bones, they took the bones and would put them in these poles, in these pillars. And Tony Tuxon had seen these in situ and asked if they would, he commissioned them to make these, not as funereal objects, but as art objects. And these are still in the Art Gallery of New South Wales today. Bark paintings began to be sold in the early 1960s, and these are some early examples that ended up in museums later. They were made in 1963 and 1974, and by that time, they probably were they would have been starting to collect them in the museums. But Aboriginal art has been available to the wider public only since the 1960s. It wasn't until the early 1970s that what we think of as modern Aboriginal art came to the attention of a broader world and entered into the elaborate monetized matrices of the art market. And this began at a place called Papunya, and later, is it here? Yuendumu is over here, but we'll talk about Papunya now. Papunya was a settlement in which the Australian government required the most isolated of the desert communities of Aborigines to come in from the desert and come into this settlement. These were tribes that knew nothing about each other. They were completely isolated from their land, and they were placed in this place about which they knew nothing. So it was a remarkably unhappy place, but it's what the government did in those days. But in the early 1970s, a teacher, an art teacher named Jeffrey Barden, introduces to the community acrylic paints to replace ground ochres and other naturally occurring materials. And he asked the senior Aboriginal men in the community for permission and advice on the honey ant dreaming for a mural at the school. And here you see the mural. This caused considerable discussion about the propriety of depicting sacred knowledge in a secular setting among these elders. And remember, the elders are of different dreamings and different tribes. So there was also the question of, can this other tribe see these parts of our dreaming? So this is how vexed and elaborate these systems were. But one of the Papunya elders, old Tom Onion Chapangati, owned the honey ant dreaming, and he gave permission to a number of local men to paint the mural. And at about the same time, Barden provided artist board and paints, and with the help of other Aborigines in the community, the Papunya men began painting in acrylic on board. Initially, respect for ceremonial proprieties caused more naturalistic depictions to replace the sacred iconography. So they just began painting kangaroos and other objects which weren't necessarily revealing anything. Eventually, recognition that conventional motifs could be described without revealing sacred secrets allowed a return to a traditional style. So artboard, which you see here in the painting room in 1972 at Papunya, was quickly replaced by the more portable unstretched canvas. And this kind of galvanized the community, gave them purpose, and they became quite prolific in producing these artworks on canvas and on board. So their traditional country lay kilometers away, where they had lived as hunter-gatherers until the 1960s. But this was one way in which they could express their land in a European settlement. One of the first of the indigenous artists in this community to paint with dots was Johnny Warankula Chupurula, and his Water Dreaming of 1972. Is one of the 3 water chukurpas that he painted around August of 1972, at a time when it rained incessantly in his region. His holy site was a place a little further away called Kalipinipa, and he is revealing that water dreaming based on that place. It's a huge flat clay pan, which, due to its geological character, stores runoff from range like a sponge and contained a natural spring. So every feature of the landscape, as you can imagine, water is quite precious out in these desert communities. So it was a holy site. So he includes here, in this one particularly, the Water Dreaming 1972 of the one here with the dots. There was some concern that the imagery that he was creating was violating sacred ideas, and so he covered up that surface with these dots. So that was one of the first uses of this kind of dot painting. The symbols in the painting represent flowing water, but he also is including elements of the edible plants of the region. Barden helped the Aboriginal painters transfer depictions of their stories from desert sand to paint on canvas. They soon realized that there might be offense, and so they decided to eliminate the sacred elements and abstracted the designs into dots to conceal their sacred designs, which they used in ceremonies. And this then is where the dot paintings really begin, with people like the Chuparulas. There were several of them in Papunya at that time. A similar series of events, but with a little more awareness of the idea of selling art to the white community, happened in a settlement a little further away, and that was the art of the Walpiri artists of the Northern Territory in a settlement called Yuendumu, which had also been set up as bringing in Aboriginal groups. But in this case, most of them were from the same tribe, or at least the same linguistic group. So they were a little more cohesive. And by this time, this is the early 1980s, there was an awareness that this kind of painting could be sold to white settlers or white dealers. So they were a little more aware of it. Their women had been producing these decorative sticks in the settlement to sell to tourists for a long time, or at least since the late 1970s or early 1980s. So they were quite aware of the issues at hand when the principal of the school there asked the senior men to paint the doors of the community school in 1983. The work would be public and would be the basis for subsequent saleable art, which would not be ephemeral, but would be purchased and would permanently leave the community. That's another issue. In 1985, arrangements for the secularization of the art were made in Yuendumu by the Artists Aboriginal Association. And this group, the Warlukurlangu Artists Association, was one of the first Aboriginal-run organizations to benefit from commercial sales of traditional artworks. Now, okay. I love this one of him sitting there. Patty Lewis was one of the main figures from the 1980s until he died. And you see here they're beginning to paint on the floor, on the ground, putting out a big piece of canvas. And I love the dog sleeping there. But the initial ones were these doors, which were created for the school. And they also show a variety of dreamings, a variety of different styles. Eventually, 9 of the original 30 Yuendumu doors were taken to the South Australian Museum, where they now reside. And so they now join with a different approach to the dot painting or to desert painting. The cover of Wally Caruana's book is one of the greatest early works of the Yuendumu painters. And this is Patty Juparula Nelson, Patty Japaljari Sims, and Quentwenjai Jungarai Spencer. So you see, it's like American Blacks who were given names of those Westerners, those Anglos, the whites, on whose property they lived in this case. But they were also known by their tribal names. And this is the star dreaming, which was enormous. It was a great big one, and they all worked on this on the ground. In 1989, 6 of these Yuendumu artists out of that artist community installed a yam dreaming painting in the exhibition Magicienne de la Terre at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. This exhibition marked a significant point in the recognition of Aboriginal and other Indigenous art abroad, and placed it in a high art context rather than as ethnographic artifact. And you can see how huge it is here in the Pompidou Center. See the figures standing next to it. This was a really significant exhibition. Some of the art was Haitian, some African, and it's placing it as, Indigenous art is art. And this is breaking down those Western created, those Eurocentric ideas of what constitutes art. And this brings us now to, this is really the beginning as well of the ever-vexed interactions between ancestral imagery and the voracious Western art world. And this brings us to, I wanted to put this one up. This is just an example of what now happens. This is when I was last in Sydney and just went to a gallery. So here we have these paintings done on the ground in the outback, brought into Sydney and put in your standard Western art gallery situation. The openings at these things were always quite interesting because they would bring in the traditional artists who would often come in nearly nothing on, wandering around and singing, doing their chants with Chardonnay sipping society dames from Sydney. So a real interaction at that time. And this brings us to the fascinating figure of Emily Kunwareyi, the epitome of this interaction. She was born in 1910 or thereabouts, we're not really sure. She did not take up painting seriously until she was nearly 80. She lived in the Amantiere language group at Al-Hakere in the Utopia community, which is about 250 miles northeast of Alice Springs. This is really remote. Utopia, though, is one of the only Aboriginal communities that successfully resisted control by outside governmental or religious organizations and maintains to this day its traditional way of life. Hence, it's far healthier than similar Aboriginal groups. Emily's initial artistic training was as a traditional Indigenous woman, preparing and using designs for women's ceremonies. Her training in Western art techniques began, along with the rest of the Utopian community, with batik. Her first batik cloth works were created in the 1980s, but later she moved from batik to painting on canvas. And here you see her painting what becomes her biggest piece, her Earth's Creation of 1994. And she began painting in a variety of styles. This is her Emu Woman Dreaming, in which these dots represent seeds of plants that she knew. This became one of her original artistic styles. She moves on later to Yam Dreamings, another of her dreamings, in which she paints in a different way. And all of them were immediately amazed. People were amazed to discover this totally tribal woman painting in this way. And this piece, Earth's Creation, in 2007, was purchased by the Gallery and Cultural Museum for $1 million. The Alice Springs, this set a Sydney auction record for Aboriginal artwork. And so you can imagine now the frenzy of dealers and get-rich-quick exploiters began. The success and demand for her paintings caused her many problems within the community as she tried to maintain her individual identity. The myth of the woman in her 80s who had never been outside the Central Desert becoming a great painter was one reason for her popularity. She had, in fact, been already to Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, and Canberra, though this was only after she had become famous. But there was much pressure from the white community for her to paint in a certain way. They decided that this was the kind of art, for example, the dot paintings, that sold best. And so they wanted her to continue to paint in this way. And with success came unwanted attention. Many other inexperienced art dealers would go to her community and try to get a piece of the action. She herself once described to a friend how she had escaped from 5 or 6 carloads of wannabe art dealers at Utopia. So she is an example of an Aboriginal artist who was relentlessly pursued by carpetbaggers toward the end of her career and produced at that time then a large but inconsistent body of work. Now, the big problem about this, not problem, but this painting is absolutely overwhelming to see. As a Westerner, I have never been more moved by an artwork than some of the works that I've seen of Emily's. Now, what do we do with that aesthetic response? What does that mean when people make comments about her art as being like Monet or like another Western artist? And that we have these strong aesthetic reactions, even though they have nothing to do with what Emily says her paintings are about. And this becomes a really significant question of this interaction. I was at a conference once when a woman, an Anglo student, was trying to do an iconographical description and discussion of Emily's works and other Aboriginal works. The anthropologists in the audience stood up and said that this was not to be allowed, that this didn't have anything to do with what her art was about. But the point still remains that we respond to it. So what do we do with that question and that problem? In 2008, a major exhibition of Emily's work in Japan was extremely successful. And this is the curator, Margot Neal, who was also one of my students in Australia at the ANU, organized this exhibition. And the patron of Indigenous art declared at this exhibition that the debate about its value was also over. This exhibition takes the life out of the debate about the Indigenous art versus non-Indigenous art. She has been anointed as not just a great Indigenous artist, which she is, but a great artist, full stop. So she has been totally assimilated, I guess, into the Western art world. So what do we do with that? So that's one thing we can all contemplate. And I hope you did get to see that little video. You might have been able to see it. And finally, I want to look at some of the Aboriginal artists, just briefly, those who have been trained in Western art, of which there are now many. And do we consider them Aboriginal artists? Do we just consider them artists? One of the most interesting and iconic is Lynn Onus, who tragically died quite young. And he has created some of the most iconic Australian pieces today. One of them is the fruit bats, in which he has hung these images of fruit bats in Aboriginal colors and designs. He is himself, he's half Scottish, and his father was a famous trained Aboriginal artist, an urban Aborigine from Melbourne, who was also a communist. So Lynn Onus is raised in this kind of environment, but he's fully initiated himself. And on the ground are little roundels of bat poop painted in Aboriginal colors, and they're hanging off of the most iconic piece of mundane suburban Australia, and that is the Hills hoist. This is the standard clothesline in every Australian backyard. So this is his piece on with a commentary. One of his earlier pieces, The Dingoes, is in the National Gallery of Australia, again painted in the Aboriginal colors, and one of them is going through a fence. We all know perhaps the story of the rabbit-proof fence, and the idea also of incarceration. There's a much higher level of incarceration of Aborigines in Australia. So he's making a commentary on that. But I once took a group of elementary school kids through the gallery, and this figure is this dingo is a lighter color than the other ones, and the kids immediately said, "Oh, he's a ghost, you know, he's an apparition." They understood that immediately. But then we had an interview with Linonis and said, "Oh, is that why you painted him?" He says, "No, I just ran out of colors." Now that may be a lie too, but anyway, he's a really remarkable figure. Another one which raises some other really interesting questions about Aboriginal art is the figure of Ginger Riley, who was a tribal artist, but his style is not in a traditional Aboriginal style. It's really almost a kind of folk art, and this brings up questions about do they have to remain static in their use of iconography. Ginger Riley is now considered one of the major Aboriginal artists of that time. And finally, we come to the question of using these motifs in contemporary Australian culture. You know, they start to appear on T-shirts and coffee mugs and every tea towel in the country. And also, one of these designs, this designed by a known artist, appears in the recent Australian passport. So my passport has that figure as well. I'm a dual citizen, so I have this passport as well. And this raises questions too about, have we just gotten over the idea that these are sacred images or not? And finally, probably the most well-known Aboriginal piece is the flag. The Aboriginal flag, which now flies over every building in Australia, was designed by an Aborigine, Harold Thomas. He's the creator of the Australian flag. He designed his flag when he was only 24, just out of art school. He too is one of the stolen generation. He was taken away from his parents at an early age and sent to boarding school. And finally, just today, I'm adding this one. I just heard that Archie Moore at the Venice Biennale is the first Australian and first Indigenous artist to receive the Golden Lion, the major award of the Venice Biennale. And he has done this by creating his entire ancestral family tree. So he has something like 4,000 names here. And again, back to ancestry, back to the importance of family. Okay, so that's it. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or what do you think about this problem of how we relate to Aboriginal art? Let's see, who do I have? Can I see you all? Let's see. I'll stop share. There we go. Okay. Alex, did you have a question?
No, but I would say that I think even Western art is very much ethnographic. I don't think you could categorize, that only primitives, quote unquote, do ethnographic art. Okay.
In what way?
Well, we paint things that are representational to us
in
that way.
Yeah. And Christian iconography is just as much a process of learning. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in a way, that whole construction of it being ethnographic is simply another one of colonialist
Yes,
ways of doing this.
yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Anyone else? Maureen? Can you unmute yourself?
There. Yeah, and I mentioned before that I had been in Australia 20 years ago, and I just remember then being so, you know, the tourists were so disrespectful of
Oh,
the
yeah.
art and everything, and saddens me that it probably hasn't changed much.
Well, the one place that, you know, in Uluru, you know, they used to climb it, and Aborigines did not want that done.
I walked around it because they clearly didn't want that, but have they changed that?
Yes, they now have, because it's now in custodianship of the Aboriginal tribe.
Oh,
At
good.
the time, it wasn't, probably.
Yeah,
And
1990, the early 90s, I guess, is when I was.
okay, yeah, that was just starting to happen, and they're trying to keep people off. I don't know yet what the final word has been on that, but
I was so taken by the art, and it's sad that we can't just accept that it's art.
yeah, exactly. Anyone else? Catherine?
Oh, yeah, I think it'll be a great day when we stop hyphenating the putting words in front of artists
Yeah.
and let it be a universal global artist. And who cares
Yeah.
if it's,
Yes.
you know, from this country or that country? Artists steal from each other. You look at Picasso. I was shocked one time when I was a young art student and you saw Picasso's studio, and in the back, if you look past his paintings, were all these African.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That he
They've
just
always done that.
lifted,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And I do think, unfortunately, the influence of the colonists does tend to, of course, like they say, you know, you want to ruin an art area, you want to ruin an art, not movement, but a style, just tourists there, and will lower the quality and cheapen it to the point where, like you said, it's on, you know, a coffee cup or whatever.
Yeah.
But one thing I was really amazed at, and that you're the first person I've ever heard talk about the dot patterns, I thought went back to ancient times, but apparently that's just a recent development.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's amazing that, I mean, they are now saying, well, there were examples a little bit earlier, and there were Aboriginal artists in the 19th century who had been exposed to Western culture, and they were making some art. I haven't talked, for example, about Albert Anamachira, who was a very, very popular and well-known Aboriginal artist who was painting in a Western style from the 1950s. He lived at the Hermansburg mission. And again, there were all these horrible stories of you know, prejudice and how he wasn't allowed to go to an exhibition of his own work, you know, that kind of stuff. So yeah, they're all, but the one to me that's really, really awful is the greed of the art market and what has happened because of that. You know, just absolute exploitation and faking. One of those videos I think I put up was about an Aboriginal woman talking about the fakes that are being made in places like Indonesia, you know. Yeah, so it's the problem of money, because money has a completely different idea in an Aboriginal community. You know, Emily's money was just taken by her relatives and ancestors, and yeah, she didn't care. I mean, you know, get him another pickup truck, that's what he needs, fine, you know. So there's just a whole different conception of what value is, you know, in that kind of a setting. So let's see, who else has questions? Yeah, have the Aboriginal artists continued bark painting? In the very remote tribal regions, yes, but it's a very arduous process to do. You have to strip the bark and wet it and then let it sit, and it's an elaborate thing. So if I would recommend to all of you too to see the film 10 Canoes. It's the first film have you seen it? Yeah.
I have seen it. I wanted to comment on that. It's funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
But I was a sailor, so I know about boat building. Well, there was a person that built boats, and it was called origami boat building, because you take a flat piece of something and you fold it up and make a boat out of it. Well, in the movie 10 Canoes, they showed the Aborigines how they did that. There is a tree in that country called the boat tree, and they can strip the bark, a big giant piece of bark off of it, and they soak it in the water, and then they tie the ends together to make a boat to go out into the rushes to gather birds' eggs. And I thought that was such a novel thing. It was a great movie.
The best part of that is if you could see the documentary of the making of the movie, because Rolf is there. Did you see that?
No, I have not.
Oh, it's wonderful, because the Aborigines who he's using as the actors, they are from the settlements, they are from Arnhem Land, but they're westernized. He had real trouble getting them to take off their clothes.
Oh,
because they
show war and everything, don't they?
Yeah. And he had to take off his own clothes before they would take off theirs. They were very, very hesitant about the whole thing.
I'll be darned.
They had to bring in older elders again to retrieve a lot of the information that these Aborigines had lost. So I always say now, Aborigines, just hold on, try to be patient. Maybe our civilization will die out. And if you kept some of the old ways, maybe you'll get it back. But I see no hope for the integration of a lot of it. It's still, they have a 20-year less mortality rate. I mean, their life expectancy is 20 years less than white Australia. It's just such a clash of worldviews that it's very hard to integrate it. But yeah, I'm not saying they're going to die out. I'm not saying that, but yeah,
we have the same problem with our American Indians.
Well, it's very much the same. And I was thinking about that. I know Aborigines because we worked with them. I know very few Native Americans, and I think that's common with a lot of Americans for that same reason. They're just not around that much. Okay. Maureen?
Hi. I had traveled to Australia in 2018. In fact, I was just looking at some pictures. And as it basically was a boat trip down the coast from Darwin to Broome.
Right.
And it was just a wonderful trip.
Oh, yeah. Around. Oh, okay.
And as we were flying originally from Sydney to Darwin, we could see the small fires everywhere. And, they explained that those are controlled burns. It was an Aboriginal thing of clearing the land so you can replant. And it was always controlled, never got out of control. White men came with cattle and sheep. Stopped doing that because we need that for food. Okay, now they're going back to it. However, as we were approaching Broome, the smoke from a huge grass fire was just horrible. And they said, they kind of have that same idea about controlled burns, but they're doing it from helicopters, dropping flaming, flammable liquids, and it's just not the same.
Yeah.
Made a beautiful sunset, but
the amazing thing, if I flew once from Europe back home across in the daytime across the entire length, it looks exactly like an Aboriginal painting. It's amazing. You can really sense where those lines are of the rocks, and it was really astonishing, you know.
Yeah, the other thing I loved about the trip as we were looking at the rock formations is how much it resembled Arizona.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It looks very much, and where we lived in Canberra had hills that look very much like California too, you know, which is kind of the subject I'm going to be talking about next week.
And the crocodiles are really, really big.
Yeah, I've never been to where the crocodiles are.
No, that was a fun part of the trip. No, you don't want to get down on that. Don't walk near the water. No,
Yeah.
600-pound.
And their fires,
monsters.
their fires, so it's the same problem we're having, you know, it's exactly the same kinds of issues. Except they're worried about not the burning of eucalyptus, which everything is blamed on here, or often is. It's there, the imported pine trees, which again, don't belong there.
Yeah.
And they're seen as the ones that cause the fires, so.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Oh, that was it. It's a
Okay.
great trip. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and the best beaches in the world, really.
Erica, I had a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your explanation of the dream time. And I'm very curious about reading more about it. My first knowledge of Australia came with the film, I think it was called The Ninth Wave. Way
Oh,
back,
the last wave,
the last wave.
Richard
Okay.
Chamberlain, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
That's
And
completely
ever since
contrived.
then, it was what?
It was completely contrived, but yeah,
Oh.
yeah,
But that was my first introduction to anything called the dream time. And I've always been really
Yeah.
curious about it.
yeah. I must admit, it's very hard for me to quite grasp it. They're
Mhm.
very aesthetic. That is, you know, it's all about that cosmology. Their
Mhm.
entire worldview is that cosmology. I like the one that Wim Wenders did on that video about Bruce Chatwin. That section talks to contemporary Aborigines about what the idea of what's sacred and what isn't, you know. But I suppose in some religions we have that too, don't we? We have some idea that you really can't understand grace or the Trinity or whatever until you understand other levels of knowledge, I guess. Yeah. But anyway, it's a hard one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Good day.